Brain anatomy and function. Learning objectives. Understand the basic anatomy and function of the 6 regions of the brain. Outline the lobes of the cerebrum and their major functions. List the 3 layers of the meninges, the importance of the spaces between them, and their functional relationship to the brain and the cranial bones. Describe the function of the cerebral spinal fluid as well as the basics of its production, circulation, and ultimate reabsorption into the bloodstream. Vocabulary words. You can find these vocabulary words in bold text throughout the presentation. This image depicts the basic anatomy of the brain. The brain is composed of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Let's get into more detail. The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain that can be divided into 4 different lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. This region of the brain is responsible for many of the higher neurological functions such as memory, emotion, and consciousness. The cerebral cortex is the outermost portion of the cerebrum, and it is composed of gray matter. The rest of the cerebrum can be found beneath this covering. The cerebrum is composed of 2 hemispheres, which are separated by the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure separates the cerebrum into the right and left hemispheres. Deep within this area of the brain, the corpus callosum, composed of white matter, connects the 2 hemispheres and provides the major pathway for communication between these 2. Cortex. The cerebrum is covered by a continuous layer of gray matter, known as the cerebral cortex. This is a thin region of wrinkled gray matter that is involved with the functioning of the nervous system. The folding of the gray matter allows for more to fit within the limited space of the skull. The ridges of one of the wrinkles in the gray matter is called a gyrus, while the groove between the 2 gyri is known as a sulcus. There are landmarks among this region of the brain that are used to separate the cerebral cortex into 4 major lobes. The lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe. Superior to the lateral sulcus are the parietal and frontal lobes, which are separated by the central sulcus. The posterior region of the cerebral cortex is the occipital lobe. These images do a great job at illustrating the cerebral cortex and the information I just highlighted about this area of the brain. Notice here the 4 different lobes of the cerebral cortex. Next, I will review these 4 in more detail. Remember, the lobes of the cerebral cortex are paired, meaning that there is one on each hemisphere of the brain. Regions of the cerebral cortex are associated with different functions and responsibilities. The frontal lobes are located at the front of the brain and are involved with higher cognitive functions. Functions of the frontal lobe include decision-making, problem-solving, conscious thought, attention, emotional and behavioral control, speech production, personality, intelligence, and body movement. There are a few important substructures located within the frontal lobe where these different functions occur. They are the premotor cortex, motor cortex, the prefrontal cortex, and Broca's area. The premotor cortex involves planning and coordinating body movement. The motor cortex controls voluntary movement. The prefrontal cortex is involved with higher level cognitive functions, executive functioning, thinking and problem solving. And Broca's area is involved with speech production. The parietal lobe is located at the top of the brain, above the temporal lobe and between the frontal and occipital lobes. It is responsible for receiving and processing sensory information. One critical area in the part of the brain is the primary somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for processing somatic sensations. Somatosensation is the main sensation associated with the parietal lobe. All of the physical senses are processed in this area. These include touch, pressure, a tickle, temperature, pain, an itch, vibration, and more general senses of the body, such as proprioception, which is the sense of body position. One interesting fact about this section is that areas of the body that are more sensitive take up more processing space in this area of the brain. Temporal lobes are on both sides of the brain near the temples. Significant functions of this area of the brain include primary auditory sensation, language comprehension, memory acquisition, object recognition, and learning. The auditory cortex is critical for hearing and processing auditory information. Wernicke's area aids in the ability to understand words. Memory is a sensory function because memories are recalled sensations. For example, you smell chocolate chip cookies and think of times you baked with your mom. Or you hear a certain song and it brings you back to a specific time you heard it play. Structures here are responsible for establishing long-term memory. However, the ultimate location of the memories is in the region where the sensory perception was processed. The lobe is located at the back of the brain and is the smallest of the four lobes in the cerebral cortex. It contains the primary visual cortex, which is largely responsible for visual processing. Aside from visual processing, functions of the occipital lobe include visual interpretation, visual data collection, object and facial recognition, depth and distance perception, and visual world mapping. The diencephalon is the central portion of the brain and the connection between the cerebrum and the rest of the nervous system. It is located deep beneath the cerebrum, above the brainstem. It is comprised of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is an egg-shaped structure that lies above the brainstem in the middle of the brain. There are actually two, side by side, thalami, as there is one in each hemisphere of the brain. This is the body's information relay system. All of the sensory information, except the sense of smell, passes through here and is processed through the thalamus before it is sent to the cerebral cortex for interpretation. The thalamus also has a role in functions such as sleep, wakefulness, alertness, consciousness, learning, and memory. The hypothalamus is also deep in the brain. This structure's main function is to maintain homeostasis and keep the body at a stable state. It helps regulate temperature, blood pressure, mood, hunger and thirst, and the sleep-wake cycle. This is completed by influencing the autonomic nervous system or by managing hormones. Cerebellum. The cerebellum is known as the little brain, and it is located at the base of the brain directly behind the brainstem. While it only makes up 10% of brain mass, it contains 50 to 80% of the total neurons in the brain. It is covered by a layer of gray matter known as the cerebellar cortex. The inner portion of the cerebellum is composed of white matter. The major responsibilities of the cerebellum is to coordinate voluntary movement, fine-tune motor commands, and maintain equilibrium. It helps the individual maintain balance, muscle tone, and posture. Aside from these major responsibilities, the cerebellum is also plays a major role in cognition, language learning, eye movement, and reflexes. The brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla. This part of the brain is responsible for many vital functions such as breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate. Let's take a look at the individual sections of the brainstem. Midbrain is the smallest part of the brainstem, located between the thalamus and the pons that functions as a relay system. It transmits necessary information for vision and hearing. It also plays a role in motor movement and reflexes. Pons, a Latin word meaning bridge, is a thick bundle of white matter that links the cerebellum and the spinal cord. It is visible on the anterior surface of the brainstem. It manages pain signals as it relays and regulates the signals that provide the sensation of pain below the neck. And this part of the brain assists other parts, such as the medulla, and helps regulate autonomic functions such as breathing and influences the sleep cycle. The medulla is the lowest part of the brainstem and helps to form the connection between the brain and the spinal cord. It contains pyramidal tracts that send motor signals from the motor cortex down the spinal cord. The tracts then cross over in the medulla and result in the right motor cortex controlling the left side and the left motor cortex controlling the right side. Sensory information also travels through the medulla. This part of the brain is responsible for the regulation of involuntary functions of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. The meninges. The meninges are three protective layers of connective tissue that cover the brain and the spinal cord. The three layers of membranes are known as the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Within the meninges, there are three spaces: the epidural space, the subdural space, and the subarachnoid space. The meninges protect and anchor the brain and provide a support system for blood vessels, nerves, lymphatics, and cerebrospinal fluid within the central nervous system. In this image, you can see the arrangement of the different layers along with the spaces in between them. Here you can see I have highlighted the 3 different layers of the meninges. The dura mater is the outmost layer closest to the skull. It is a thick, fibrous protective sheath that is anchored to the inner surface of the cranium and vertebral cavity. It contains dural sinuses, which allow blood to leave the brain and allow cerebrospinal fluid to re-enter circulation. The arachnoid mater is the middle layer of the meninges. It is a thick, fibrous tissue that forms a loose sac around the central nervous system. This layer does not contain blood vessels or nerves, but it does have connective tissue projections that look like a spider web unattached to the pia mater. The innermost layer is the pia mater. This is a thin, fibrous membrane. There are many blood vessels that pass through this layer to supply the brain tissue with blood. It also helps to contain cerebrospinal fluid. There are 3 significant spaces between the meningeal layers: the epidural, subdural, and subarachnoid space. The epidural space, epi meaning above, is between the skull and the bones of the vertebrae and the dura mater. In the spine, where the spinal cord ends near the lumbar vertebrae, is the site of a local epidural anesthesia which anesthetizes the spinal nerve roots, which results in pain relief. The subdural space, sub meaning below, is below the dura mater, in between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. This space is very narrow. The subarachnoid space is below the arachnoid mater, between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater layers. Cerebrospinal fluid circulates in this space, which functions as a cushion and protection. Here you can find arachnoid granulations, small one-way valves that allow cerebrospinal fluid to flow from the subarachnoid space into the dural sinuses. The spinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is essentially clear fluid composed of water, small molecules, and electrolytes. Cerebrospinal fluid circulates through and around the central nervous system. It functions to protect the brain and spinal cord, provide mechanical support, acts as a shock absorber, provides nutrients, and removes waste from interstitial fluids of nervous tissue and returns them to the bloodstream. Cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the ventricles by the choroid plexus epithelium. Ependymal cells of the ventricles surround blood capillaries and filter the blood to produce the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid flows from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle. Here, more cerebrospinal fluid is produced. This clear fluid is made continuously as it pulses through the ventricular system. From the third ventricle, it flows into the fourth ventricle and then the subarachnoid space. Within the subarachnoid space, the cerebrospinal fluid flows around the central nervous system. Arachnoid granulations, outpocketings of the arachnoid membrane into the dural sinuses, help reabsorb the cerebrospinal fluid into the blood along with the metabolic waste. From the dural sinuses, the blood drains out and enters the rest of the blood in circulation throughout the body.